Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening for the latest edition of rabble.ca's webinar, Off the Hill. Tonight, our topic is the need for justice reform in Canada. Hello, my name's Libby Davies, and I'm very delighted to be joined by Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer, author, social justice activist, and the chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. Welcome to you, Pam.
Thank you.
Paul Taylor, who is the Executive Director of FoodShare Toronto. Welcome back, Paul. Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. Hello, Leah. And Karl Nerenberg, Rabble's parliamentary reporter in Ottawa. And hello to you, Karl.
Hi.
Now, for those of you watching on Zoom, you can participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. So just look for that on your screen. We'll certainly do our best to address your questions. And for those watching via Facebook, welcome to you. In Canada, over many decades, we've had royal commissions, public inquiries, and major reports on systemic racism, injustice, and violence faced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals and communities within the criminal justice system and within society overall. Some of these reports include the 1984 Equality Now Special Committee on Visible Minorities in Canadian Society, the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 2018 Taking Action Against Systemic Racism and Religious Discrimination, including Islamophobia, in a report to Parliament, and the 2019 National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. Canada's history is founded on colonialism and racism. The criminal justice system stems from that history. More reports are clearly not the answer for creating systemic change in the justice system or in society overall. StatsCan shows that more than $15 billion was spent on policing in Canada in the years 2017-2018, and the amount of funding for the police is growing while federal austerity budgets have cut social programs over the past decades. We know that many activists and communities are calling for defunding of existing policing services and for diverting funds to needed resources for mental health wellness, harm reduction, community development, and youth services, just to name a few. And yesterday in Parliament, we witnessed a pivotal moment when Jagmeet Singh, leader of the federal NDP, called out a Bloc MP as racist in denying unanimous consent for his motion on systemic racism in the RCMP. I'm hoping that our discussion tonight will focus on how we can bring about meaningful action and change against systemic racism within the RCMP, the criminal justice system, and within Parliament itself. So, to our panel, first off, we know the federal government has jurisdiction over the RCMP, but police services are also provincial and local. What role and responsibility does the federal government have overall to break down the culture of racism, police violence, and harm, particularly within the RCMP, but within other institutions as well? And Pam, let's begin with you, and then we'll go to Leah and Paul and then Karl. So Pam.
Well, thank you. It's a really important question, and I'm happy to be on this panel. I know we're on all different native territories. I'm in Scugog territory tonight, but we're literally in the middle of another movement, an anti-racism movement. And, you know, for the federal government has a huge role to play. They have jurisdiction over national security and public safety. And they also have constitutional powers over issues that are of national interest. Well, I can't think of anything that is more important in this moment in time than the violent racism and sexualized violence and killings and brutalities of Indigenous peoples and Black peoples in this country based on racism and hatred in all of the police forces, not just the one that the federal government has jurisdiction over. Clearly, they should have cleaned house at the RCMP long ago. But when we're talking about all of the provincial and local police forces, they have a national responsibility over public safety and national security to use whatever levers they have, including constitutional or financial levers and legal levers, to make sure that everybody falls in line and gets rid of what is a threat to life, safety, and security of the person for Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, and all peoples that will be considered othered by the majority population.
Yeah. Now, Leah, we saw what happened yesterday in Parliament, and it's very regrettable that Jagmeet Singh's motion did not receive unanimous consent, because it was a very strong motion, directly would have come from the House. The House would have spoken. There is a huge issue of the overall responsibility of the federal government. So how does that play out for you in terms of the role that you have as an MP?
Sure. I just want to go back to, and then I want to also comment on Pam's really thoughtful comments and yours too, Libby. Like, you know, this country wasn't just based on colonialism, but the wrongful dispossession of lands of Indigenous people. And that's why we have RCMP. They put RCMP in place to brutally rip us off our lands. And then they used RCMP to take our kids off to residential school. The RCMP, the whole foundation of the RCMP was based on racist, paternalistic to be used for those means. And I think we see that today. So they also were part of enforcing genocide, which happened in residential school. And I think we need to acknowledge that history when we acknowledge the culture of policing in this country. You know, and as members of Parliament, you know, as an Indigenous member of Parliament, we pledge an oath. And I had to pledge an oath to the Queen. Can you imagine an Indigenous person having to pledge an oath to the person responsible of dispossessing your lands and fighting to take away your rights? And I became a child of the crown, and I had to pledge an oath. I almost died that day. I actually went home and shed quite a lot of tears that day. It just felt so demoralizing, and I questioned my choice. Mm-hmm. But Pam mentioned Section 7 of the Charter. You know, as members of Parliament, we're supposed to uphold the dignity, liberty, and security of the person. Jagmeet Singh, very proud of our leader, put forward a motion with five very clear guidelines on how we could move forward. One, you know, a motion to review the $10 million that's spent on RCMP every day in policing. Two was to increase non-police investments and non-violent intervention, de-escalation, mental health supports, addiction supports. I've just spent, and including the 9 years our community has spent fighting for a 24/7 low barrier safe space for women, girls, to us LGBTQIA people. I'm begging for that money to ensure that the RCMP are accountable to the public, to report instances of force, and the last one is to immediately launch a full review of the use of force by the RCMP, including reviewing the tactics and the training that was given to RCMP officers in dealing with the public. If members of Parliament can uphold our legal responsibilities, our oath that we have to take, and if people can be so flippant to decide when they want to follow the law and not as members of Parliament, I find that abhorrent. And I'm really proud of our party and our leader for clearly calling out systemic racism and not backing down. We have to name it. So I'm pretty proud today. I'm a proud New Democrat today. I have to be honest.
It was a very defining moment. Paul, turning to you, we know you're in Toronto, and obviously the focus of police services in Toronto is huge. But if you can sort of relate that to sort of a federal overview as well, what is it that you want to see from a federal perspective that will impact what's taking place in policing in your community?
Well, you know, I'm going to talk about maybe for a moment the the RCMP, but also some of the institutions connected to government. So
Yep.
first, I'm going to say that, you know, the federal government has a huge responsibility to not break down solely the culture of the institution, but I think the institution of in and of itself. You know, it's responsible for creating it's responsible for creating the RCMP, and it's responsible for the harms that the RCMP has inflicted. And I think even before we think about what goes next and how we move forward, we also have to include, I say this often, we have to include conversations about reparations for the harms that they've caused, you know, since its precursor was set up in 1873. When it comes to other institutions, you know, the federal government, I think, needs to start at home. There remain very few Black or Indigenous deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers, and chiefs of staffs. You know, I think that work is the work that they need to do. It's not a photo op work, it's not a grant, it's not a funding program, but it's critical work that it seems that the government isn't prioritizing. You know, at the organization that I work at, we recognize that we're far from perfect, but we're pretty committed to actively working to challenge white supremacy within our walls. Being a Black-led organization doesn't mean that white supremacy isn't present in our walls. So we do things like deprioritizing paid accreditation when we're hiring people and going through that process, anonymized resumes, you know, and actually reaching out to organizations that work directly with people from equity-seeking groups. And if I go back to the federal government one more time, you know, if you look at the 2018 snapshot, I was looking at it earlier today, of Canada's public service, you know, the way they break down diversity, it's broken down in a male, female, gender binary identification. They talk about age and whether or not English or French is a first language. I don't want to hear another nice speech from Justin Trudeau while he's flanked by racialized folks. What I'm really interested in is the government and its institutions to get out of the 1970s and to be a leader in actively working to dismantle white supremacy in our public institutions.
Yeah, I know that Rabble recently ran a very strong article by Robin Brown, very personal article about his experience in the federal civil service as a Black man and the racism that he encountered. So it's, you know, despite all the reports, this is still a huge issue that is systemic and has not been addressed. Just quickly turning to you, Karl, you wrote a great column today about what happened in Parliament yesterday with the unanimous consent motion. What's your take on what is the leadership role here? Well, Parliament itself, but the government for sure, in dealing with systemic racism within the RCMP, but within Parliament itself.
I mean, the federal government, to start with, has an enormous role to play in the whole area of criminal justice, narrowly defined, and then in the larger area of the social determinants that create the criminal justice system. So our criminal code in Canada, what we call a crime, is 100% a federal role. In the United States, by the way, it's interesting. People sometimes follow that in the States when talking about crossing the state line, and if somebody gets caught here or commits a crime in this state, they'll be executed, but not in that state. We don't have that in Canada. We have one criminal law for the entire country. The province of Manitoba doesn't get to pass. They get to pass, you know, traffic offenses and civil offenses within Manitoba. But what we define as a crime in Canada, that's 100% criminal. Most of people who go to prison for crimes that'll be imprisoning them for more than 2 years are now tenants of the federal government. The federal government controls that entire system, the penal system. And the RCMP functions as the provincial police in 7 of the 10 provinces and in the territories. And in the 2 provinces where it is not the provincial police, in the 2 large provinces, Quebec and Ontario and Newfoundland, it still has a very large role, and it still deals with all kinds of interprovincial criminal, so-called criminal activity and investigation, and works together with the local and provincial police there. So the federal, you know, we had this discussion once when we're talking about a minimum wage, and people, when the NDP happened to be proposing it, we're not pushing the NDP necessarily, but you remember the NDP in one campaign, I think you were still running, Libby, wanted to raise the minimum wage.
Yeah.
So people said, well, the federal minimum wage is not most people. Most workers are governed by the province. And unless you're working in transport, communications, banking, and a few other sectors, you're under provincial jurisdiction. But the point was, if the federal government raised this minimum wage, it would pull the provinces along. That was the idea. If we set an example at the federal level, that would start pulling other jurisdictions along. In the case of criminal justice, the federal government is much more leveraged than minimum wage because it controls a huge amount of the apparatus of criminal justice. And I think the RCMP was the way to begin. The RCMP is everywhere in Canada. It's trained by it's training, it's culture, its structure. It's all controlled by the federal government. Definitely when the RCMP is in New Brunswick, they're reporting to the Attorney General of New Brunswick, but it's still a federal government institution.
Karl, certainly the criminal code. I mean, I remember the provisions of the mandatory minimum sentencing that was brought in under the Harper years, which unfortunately are still there, and the incredible impact that had on racialized communities, on Indigenous people, on people who are poor. I mean, you could just see the direct correlation between the change in the law and what would happen in the court system. You know, policing is part of a larger racist systemic issue that's being raised in many of the protests and demonstrations that we've seen in the recent weeks all over the country. And also there's been, I think in the past weeks, an increased anger and frustration at the lack of follow-up on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls report. So the question I've got, and I'm going to go to Leah and then Pam, do you feel that the delay and the lack of accountability on this long overdue report that's out there is symptomatic of systemic racism at both the political level, but also at the level of fundamental change in policing? So Leah, why don't you begin?
Yeah, so 100%. You know, in 2016, the Walk for Justice initiative stopped counting the number of murdered and missing Indigenous women when they reached 4,000, I think it was 232 people. This government prior to COVID had like almost 10 months to act. And when the commissioner's letter came out on June the 3rd, they noted a lack of action and transparency, and calling for the need for international observers to make sure that they actually would act on a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We know during COVID, we've seen an increase of violence against, sorry, my dog is upset about this too, clearly. Sorry, you guys. But, you know, since COVID, we've seen an increase of violence against Indigenous women and girls. In fact, the Native Women's Association of Canada said that 1 in 5 Indigenous women have experienced some sort of violence. This government had, you know, money to throw around to bail out big corporations the last couple of weeks. They've had money to bail out pipelines. First off, the young woman who lost her life, where we're having a rally in Winnipeg, she was 16. You know, part of the calls to justice relate to policing. So I find it abhorrent and appalling, and I'm not alone in these sentiments. Certainly the commissioners have called it abhorrent. Certainly the Native Women's Association of Canada has called it abhorrent that they're now using COVID-19 as an excuse. This is the same government, let's not forget, who's in their 10th non-compliance order to immediately stop racially discriminating against First Nations kids. And as somebody who has to sit in the House of Commons and listen to my minimum human rights standards, including those contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, up for debate every day, reeks of systemic racism, reeks of white supremacy. And I think it's a critical juncture we're in, and particularly those that have platforms. We have a responsibility to name it, to own it, and to change it. Unfortunately, that did not happen yesterday, you know, in the House of Commons. However, we got to keep pushing forward.
Well, Pam, it took years to get that national inquiry. The national inquiry happened, the report is there. We now seem to be in some kind of limbo. I mean, What is your response to that? Do you see it as part of just this utter failure of political power and the system to be able to respond, and it just kind of gets pushed aside again?
Well, exactly. And I mean, your question earlier around, is this symptomatic of racism? This is racism in action. It's not a symptom. These are individuals, not systems, but individuals who are making conscious choices to allow people to die. Conscious choices, knowing what's happening. We didn't need the National Inquiry to know what was happening. We used that as a tool to push and get more information, but it was very strategic that the terms of reference for the National Inquiry specifically excluded looking at sexualized violence by the police, and specifically excluded looking at their methods and their abuses. So there's conscious choices being made every day by all these leaders to not do anything about it, which consistently tells Canadian society and everybody in it that our lives are worth less. And the result is higher rates of violence, higher rates of disappearances, exploitation, and so many different aspects of society are involved in this. The problem is the government, perpetuates that, oh, we're trying to deal with crime, we're trying to have reconciliation, but state agencies have long been involved in the sexualized violence and killing of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women and girls, not just police forces, but corrections, parole officers, social workers, teachers. Every time they do a human trafficking sting or a child porn sting, guess who's in there? Teachers, social workers, your next door neighbor, literally. And why do they do it? Because they can. And why do they think they can? Because everybody in government has immunized themselves from culpability for this, despite the fact that we have a national inquiry who has said, Canada, you are guilty of historic and ongoing genocide. And what does that mean? It's not just accidental killings of people. It's not accidental starvations. It's not accidental theft of children. It's a manifest pattern, a conscious choice being made by the people in power to destroy a group by whatever means necessary. And that's the reality we have to get around. That's what racism is. We can point to the Indian Act, but the Indian Act is a piece of paper, and the Indian Act doesn't do anything. People do things, and our government has been long engaged in these horrific acts of genocide, and it is the most direct form of racism to not do anything to stop it.
Yeah.
Can I just briefly add it? I think a really good example, thanks for your comments, Pam, is the TMX pipeline. Who's enforcing it? The RCMP. What happened with the Wet'suwet'en people, where they actually said or referenced saying to use lethal force if necessary. So the same foundations upon which the RCMP was founded is still going on today. Like, we talk about history, but it's actually not history. It's ongoing. And we know, even around just the issue around resource extraction, that around resource development, there is increased violence against Indigenous women and girls. We know that was even reported in the National Inquiry. And we know this violence is occurring, and we still use the same forces to enforce these violent human rights violations that have been noted by the United Nations. Like, there's a reason why we didn't get the Security Council seat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because Canada has a history of racism, not just abroad in like mining companies that are exploiting Indigenous people around the world, but even our behavior in our own backyard. And I'm glad we are naming it. Like, you cannot change it if you do not name it. You cannot change it if you don't own it.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that Jagmeet called it out yesterday and didn't apologize for naming it, the fact that he was kicked out and somebody who was literally going against their oath of office, which means also upholding the charter. wasn't the one kicked out, I think speaks volumes about the level of white supremacy and the normalization of racism in this country that is supported in a place called the House of Commons that I have to sit in. So this is a good time, people, because people are rising. So it's a difficult time, but at least we're rising. Like, thank goodness, some hope. I had some hope yesterday.
I think both of you have made a really excellent point, and that is, there's policies, there's history, but it's about the practice. It's about the practice that takes place by people on a daily basis and whatever role of authority they may have. And if I could bring you in, Paul, I want to come back to the question of what it is that we can do as activists, as communities that are facing systemic racism. What are some of the important things that we need to demand of our federal representatives, because we are sort of looking at this nationally, to implement systemic change against racism and violence, not only within the justice system, but within the policing system overall? What do you think are some of those key demands?
Well, I think, as Karl noted, 7 of Canada's provinces and all 3 of the territories, contract out law enforcement to the RCMP, who are all under federal jurisdiction. So I think, okay, so let's say while the federal government might not have control over all local police budgets, what they do is they have the ability to do something else. They have the ability to invest in alternatives. So there's nothing stopping the federal government from providing income transfers for the development of those alternatives to policing, as well as programs that I think actually provide security, like housing security, food security, subsidized fruits and vegetables, access to clean drinking water, and the last thing I'll say is, we also know that climate change dictates that we need to move quickly on a just transition when it comes to fossil fuel workers. I'm beginning to think we need to consider the same for the police. Maybe we need to redeploy these folks to serve and protect in other ways, like crossing guards, farm workers, building green infrastructure for farms. There's so much that these folks could be doing to be helping us actually get to where we need to go. And that's what I would call serving and protecting.
Yeah, we're going to start moving into questions, and Karl, I'm going to put the first question to you. But as we move to some of the questions from our viewers, I would like to just note that it's really important to have these public spaces for ongoing discussions, for debate on some of these critical issues. So if you appreciate this space, I encourage you to donate to Rabble. Just go to rabble.ca/donate to help these panels going. Now we're going to go to a question that came in from Kelly. It's a really good question. She says, we have a conjuncture of circumstance, the anti-racism movements, the COVID-19 crisis and its social budgetary implications, and the Parliamentary Budget Office's report on the growing wealth of the 1%. How can the movement capitalize on these circumstances and use them to organize for real change? So, Karl, why don't you take a shot at that?
Oh, thank you for the
Bring it all together.
Oh, Karl, we believe in you.
I think what you have to have is actual piece by piece goals. And I'm not going to presume to suggest or to lead a movement myself as a journalist or to suggest particular ones. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of talk about a guaranteed minimum income or guaranteed income. That might not be necessarily the best way to go. But what you have to do is to get beyond rhetoric and slogans and say, we're working for this particular goal. In the case of what the NDP proposed yesterday, and actually what earlier the Green Party had proposed in a similar way, in a different form, these were tangible proposals for reform of the RCMP in particular. I mean, Jagmeet Singh said, I'm not talking about systemic racism everywhere. I'm talking about the systemic racism of this institution. I would go to a report you mentioned, Libby, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, going way back to the 1990s, because they put an emphasis that we often forget about. When we talk about Indigenous people, we're often talking about a rights framework, and they defined rights. We talk about rights more in the negative sense: the right not to be pushed around, the right to be treated equally like everybody else. They talked about more fundamental rights, but economic rights, about the rights to ownership and control of natural resources and to control economic development in your own territory and community, and to have a land base and territory. And that is, we could look at a really radical redefinition of the relationship between the settler colonial society and the Indigenous society that fundamentally respects the right of ownership. We went a little bit part way with James Bay, where there was some recognition, and we're now with Delgamuukw and with what we the evolution of what happened in the Wet'suwet'en territory. But we can really, and we see a bit of it north of 60, but we can talk about a comprehensive view that we should no longer be having white politicians being able to say, well, these impoverished Indigenous people living in remote communities and no jobs need the crumbs that will drop from the pipeline as it passes through their community because they have nothing else. So they may have a job, maybe at the very low end of the employment scale for a very temporary period. We have to say, no, if you want to develop, you have to, the development has to start on our terms, and we have to be partners in the development, otherwise it's not going to happen. So that is just the beginnings of a conversation.
Now, if any of you would like to jump in on that, we'll spend a couple more minutes and then we'll go into another question. Leah?
So I just wanted to make note, I mean, that's what the whole point of Bill C-262 was. It was to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are like minimum human rights. They're minimum human rights that have not been afforded to Indigenous people globally, that had to be asserted in a declaration. I mean, we have an Indian Act, a racist document. We need to replace that with a human rights document. We don't need a framework. We have frameworks. We have a constitution, we have international laws, we have United Nations Declaration. The Liberal government has promised once again to adopt and implement. They were supposed to do it in June. They are reneging on that promise. And this is a way forward. If you look at the James Bay Cree example, one of the reasons that they've been so successful is because their whole agreements were framed around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There is no development that happens in James Bay Cree territory without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Cree. And so, I mean, that's a really good example of how human rights work. And so, I mean, Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, that's my backyard. You know, I as I said, 3 people shot in my riding in the month of April. We have the documentation, we have the research. It's time for action. Our party offered tangible actions. Time to act. Enough talking. Lives are on the line.
One of the questions that's come in, if I could go to Paul and Pam, from Umar, says, we understand that a reform is needed in policing, how policing is done in Canada, but how do we actually eradicate systemic racism in policing? Do we do it through defunding, education? And then the person says, doesn't that amount to devaluing and therefore demoralizing the police? Pam?
Well, you know, that's a really good question, because demoralizing the police from what? The ability to stalk, target, sexually assault, abuse, and kill Black and Native people. And if they can't do it anymore, that's demoralizing. Here's how I look at it. You know, this whole call to defund the police, what we're really saying, and I don't speak for everybody, is really defunding racism in policing. Imagine if we just defunded racism. There would be hundreds of millions not going to surveillance of Native people. We wouldn't be paying out all of the civil suits for Black and Native people who are beaten and abused by police every day. We wouldn't be paying the hundreds of millions and now billion in multiple class actions by RCMP themselves who are abused by their own people. We wouldn't have to pay the hundreds of millions in the militarization of the police, all of the tanks and SWAT teams and semi-automatic weapons and helicopters. And we would no longer be paying the millions of dollars that go to all of the police officers all across the country who are always suspended with pay and all of their legal fees paid. wow, you know how many police officers would be left if we defunded just racism in policing? We'd have this little tiny core group who could actually do their job and start protecting people and making sure that we're secure and that we're safe and we're actually surveilling for real threats. And I think if we did that, we would be okay.
Mm-hmm. Paul?
You know, I think, first of all, one of the things that just dawned on me is we have to stop calling it the justice system as well, because it's justice for whom? It's not justice for Black and Indigenous people. You know, when we talk about demoralizing things are being carded, to being arrested, to having restrictions placed on our movements, to being tossed in prisons. Those are all examples of the way the state is criminalized being poor, Black, or Indigenous. There's nothing just about that. You know, so even going back to some of the things that the federal government can do, you know, one of Justin Trudeau's fairy tales in 2015 was that he was going to end mandatory minimums that Harper introduced, as you said, Libby.
They haven't done.
Unfortunately, that promise seems to be in line behind his plan to introduce electoral reform. You know, so I think that we have an opportunity to do something radically different, because what we're doing isn't working. We can build a society that has no need for the prison industrial complex of jails, prisons, and detention centers. In the same way, you know, I think we also need to look at healthcare in a similar way. You know, this might be unpopular to say, but we don't have a healthcare system in Canada. It's a sick care system. So investing in health, I think, is something very different. And I think so too is investing in justice. Mm-hmm. It's possible for us to develop ways of caring and supporting one another that don't involve tasers and guns and tear gas. You know, I think we could be such a world leader in advancing a decent quality of life by introducing things like Karl said, you know, a minimum income floor accompanied with a guaranteed basket of public services, like things like childcare and access to affordable food and mental health care. You know, these are the things that I think we could be doing. And I think eliminate, you know, the demoralizing experiences that Black and Indigenous folks navigate daily.
Another question that's come in from Eunice, and I'll go to Karl on this one. The representation in our public, political, and economic institutions is an important way to fight racism and push for more equality. How can Canada achieve the goal of significant representation? I mean, PR would be one answer, I guess. How can our public service be more representative of our Canadian society?
Well, I mean, if you, in a couple of ways, again, to go back to particularly to Indigenous governance, I mean, I have met people who work in the Department of Indigenous Affairs, used to be called the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, who have never actually visited. They spent their whole career, they've never visited an Indigenous community. They're essentially careerist public servants for whom this is a managerial challenge, and this is a stepping stone from here to there. And, you know, in the case of, just to cut off the Indigenous aspect, I mean, governance of Indigenous people is, as many have pointed out, an all of government affair because of, you know, energy, environment, health, all these different, transport, all these different areas touch on the lives of Indigenous people. But if you had a much greater measure of self-government, you'd have much less need of minders and bureaucrats running people's lives from Ottawa. I mean, I think, you know, I think you do want to have, we have to find some way to have a more inclusive and representative public service. And I think Paul would have better ideas than I do if we could start applying the model that Paul uses for his organization to the entire public service. Maybe you'd get somewhere. I mean, part of the whole philosophy of government here is really based on personal ambition and career advancement and hierarchy and ladder climbing, rather than on service and inclusion and in relationship to the community. So you have to redefine that. You even look within the government phone directory or directory of personnel, they say hierarchy and place in hierarchy. You think you're talking about 13th century feudal society. Mm-hmm. This is still how, and in many ways, well, we sometimes call it the Mandarin it. Our public service, federal and otherwise, are essentially ancient feudal institutions that are about hierarchy and authority rather than service and connection to the community. So one way of changing it is to change the philosophy of the public service.
So panelists, we're getting quite a few questions that have come in, some by email, about how do we actually defund the RCMP? Now, Pam, I think you gave a really amazing framing about defunding racism, and certainly Jagmeet Singh's motion, if it had passed yesterday, that targeted specifically the RCMP. But the question here that's being posed is, what are the steps? Like, how would we begin to defund racism, if we want to put it that way? And I think it is a really good frame.
Yeah, so clearly there are legal mechanisms that we need to do. First of all, we need to legislate, amend, or repeal all immunity for all police forces in this country. You don't get a free pass for racialized violence. That alone would deal with such a massive problem. Number two, we also need to legislate the opening of the records, particularly for the RCMP, but all of the police forces. No more unions saying, no, you can't have access to this. We get all the disciplinary records, we get all the information, we get all the statistics and investigations, and that would get rid of another bunch of people. And then we have to legislate zero tolerance. Whatever police forces look like now or in the future, from this point forward, there has to be zero tolerance for excessive use of force, sexual assaults, the killing of unarmed Indigenous peoples and unarmed Black peoples, and so on and so forth. So those are very specific things that we can do. And these are things that the United Nations has recommended to Canada, that we should be having a zero tolerance policy. We should be having access to all the data. And the other thing the United Nations has recommended to Canada is that we actually have completely independent oversight of whatever policing looks like from today or in the future. Completely independent oversight based on all of these laws, with all of the powers needed to compel information, testimony, and all of that stuff. And if all of that happened, we'd be able to literally clean house and then really think about, what do we do with everybody that's left in terms of what do we want safety and security services to look like in the future versus this whole policing institution that we have now that isn't helping anybody.
Yeah, I was reading an article that you just wrote in Canadian Dimensions, and I thought you also made a really great observation where the RCMP commissioner said we need to return to our core values, right, in her explanation. And you made the point that those core values are racist. So we actually don't want to return to the core values of the RCMP, given what they were founded on. We've just got a few minutes left. So I think what I'm going to do is just ask each of you if you would like to make any final observation or comments. So maybe we'll go to Karl just for about a minute, and then we'll go to our other panelists just to close up. So Karl, just any final thought?
So I really wanted to reiterate what Pam just brought on the table, because I think those are very extremely important, short-term, close, focused, tangible goals that we can talk about, and they echo what the NDP put in its motion in Parliament the other day. The fact that we don't even keep records in Canada of police use of force, that we don't even know what's happening, we don't even categorize. We have no. I've been reading some research on that. The government did commission research on it, quite technical social research. There's nothing. There's no common way of talking about it. And the entire frame of reference for police, I years ago I had contact. We lived in a Gwich'in community in the Arctic, my wife and I, quite a few years ago. And at the time, somebody who I now am convinced was an agent came into the community pretending to be a paddler and hanging out with people, being friendly with everybody. And he tried to get some people to cause trouble and go throw rocks through the police station. God knows why we would do that. I mean, that's not adventurism, that's just stupid and pointless. And we were school teachers there at the time. And he talked about, but his vision of the world was, it's composed of people who are for the police and are against the police. The police have got to stop thinking of themselves as an essential institution, but rather as an auxiliary service agency.
And Karl, I'm gonna stop you there just so we can.
Please, you're welcome to stop me. I'm so sorry.
So Paul, just any final comment?
Clearly, the conversation around defunding is in the air. It's in the mainstream. We've got to keep organizing. We've got to keep demonstrating that this issue is really important to us, you know, and it's the first step in a longer process. I think we also need to push our political parties to really champion this issue. And lastly, and most importantly, we have to elect the right people, the people who are going to champion and move this work forward, not the folks that we've got in office right now. They clearly aren't.
Right on, right on. Leah.
Well, I just want to say it was just a pleasure being on this panel again. It was nice having you on this time, Pam. Haven't seen you for a while. I think I've said this many times, we're at a critical juncture. I see movement in the world happening that I haven't seen, that I've only dreamed of, around climate justice, around social justice, around human rights. And I agree. I think that now we have to rise. We have to rise up. We have to speak truth about our history. We have to acknowledge where we are at in a way that honors human rights. And that's the way forward. You know, I've often said political decisions are actually not that difficult. If we based every decision on the basis of, are we respecting human rights or not, it would be so much simpler. But unfortunately, that is not the foundation on which this country was built through the House of Commons. And we have to change that. I'm glad that our leader put forward a very progressive motion. I am proud that he stayed true to his value and conviction in the face of adversity. And I will stand beside him. And I know that there are progressive members of parliament right now that are willing to speak truth, because we are trying to fight for a better world in a really, really kind of asinine, colonial cesspool of violence. I mean, that's where I'm at right now. But there's hope. I do see hope, you know.
And Pam, any final thought?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of us, we're talking about defunding the police, defunding racism, and we're hoping that, you know, this moves forward, it becomes a movement. But in the meantime, my focus is on accountability, holding all of those perpetrators to account, in harm reduction, in making sure that from this point forward, we reduce all of the harms, whether it's, you know, getting rid of mandatory minimums, making sure that we have better criminal records legislation so that people aren't punished for life, judicial training for, you know, sexual assault cases, all of these things. And then importantly, reparations. What about all of the people who have been brutalized, sexually assaulted, imprisoned wrongly? We need reparations for all of these people, and that's not currently happening under all of the class actions. For other people, we need reparations for Black and Indigenous peoples who have been brutalized by police forces across this country, whether they want to admit it or not.
Okay, well, folks, we are out of time now, and I really want to thank all of you who watched the webinar tonight, and I really want to thank our guests. You guys just are so fantastic, and just your commentary and your observations and your thoughts about what's going on and what needs to be done. So a very special thanks to our panelists, Pam Palmater, Paul Taylor, MP Leah Gazan, and Karl Nerenberg. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you all are. If you have been watching on Zoom, do take a moment to take a poll, because we are asking you from Rabble what kind of issues you'd like to see in future webinars, and we are like taking that up, that info that you're putting out there. So in the meantime, thanks to everyone, and see you the next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.